in the next sentence. The bread is described to be made of the very best flour, and excellent, and the water, pure, fine, and clear. Now the bread, while I was there, was in general of a quality quite the reverse. So much so, indeed, that I occasionally felt it my duty to take a piece of that which was baked for Napoleon to Sir Hudson Lowe, in order that he might convince himself of its excessive badness. And Napoleon for several months made use of American biscuit, bought by his maitre d'hotel in lieu of it. Sir Hudson Lowe endeavored to excuse the badness of its quality by abusing Carr, the baker, who very naturally replied that it was extremely hard for him to be found fault with because he could not succeed in making good bread out of bad flour. The water conveyed to the butts at Longwood in the pipe lately constructed is, during a great part of 2 or 3 of the hot months, extremely turbid, nauseous and thick, and I have no doubt contributes to produce the dysentery so prevalent upon the island. So scarce is it, then, that the soldiers of the 66th Regiment are obliged to furnish numerous fatigue parties in order to drag a supply of it from Wells Cottage to Miss Mason's, about 3 miles from their camp, as many of the mounted officers of in St. Helena have reason to remember, from the falls they received in consequence of their horses being frightened by the number of casks rolling along the road. The so much boasted, pure, fine, and clear water is brought to Longwood by a servant of their own and paid by them for that purpose. In page 10, the author very wittily observes that the little man is living on a fertile plain, and that the shade afforded by the wood attached to Napoleon's residence is so luxuriant that the house is imperceptible at 300 yards among the trees which spring healthily from turf as fine and fresh as ever was trodden. The fertile plain is situated upon the summit of a mountain from 1,800 to 2,000 feet above the level of the sea, and in so exposed, unpromising, and bleak a spot that, with the exception of Longwood House and that of the company's farmer, the whole of it was uninhabited until the arrival of Napoleon, and presented little else than a barren, melancholy waste, although probably too good in the opinions of Sir Hudson Lowe and his fulsome adulator for the fallen emperor. The fact is that the Longwood is almost wholly composed of a species of gumwood, as stated by Mr. Secretary Brooke in his History of St. Helena, published in 1808, page 258, who, speaking of logwood, says the gumwood, however, is the only kind of tree which grows there. The gumwood is a tree which, in consequence of the leaves being chiefly confined to the ends of the branchlets, does not afford that thick foliage so necessary to intercept the rays of the sun. This is amply proved by the trees not furnishing even a sufficiency of shade to preserve the grass that grows round the trunk in a state of partial verdure during the hot season, to which the distance they are planted from each other also materially contributes. Gumwood is chiefly used as fuel and affords food for millions of large blue flies that are very fond of saccharine juice, which at certain seasons of the year exudes from the tree, and whose visits in myriads are most irksomely frequently at Longwood. As if the author had not done ample justice to the fertile plain and luxuriant shade, he proceeds to say, the country surrounding it, Longwood, is beautifully adapted for riding or driving, the whole of which, to the extent of 12 or 13 miles, Napoleon has been undisturbed privilege of enjoying unseen and unattended. To the above assertion, which I should have deemed truly extraordinary had it proceeded from any other writer than the author of the Facts, it is hoped the following statement will be considered as a sufficient refutation. Pursuant to the regulation established by Sir Hudson Lowe in October 1816, Napoleon was ordered even within the limits allotted to him, not to stir off the high road, not to speak to any person he met, nor to enter any house, unless in the presence of a British officer who had directions to interfere whenever he thought proper. And even those who procured passports from the governor to see him were prohibited from conversing with any of his suite, while the persons received at Longwood were obliged to make a report of the conversations which they had held with Bonaparte or the other prisoners. This may account for the perverted details and the calumnious paragraphs which have appeared since Napoleon's confinement, evidently furnished by persons who had some intercourse with Longwood, so that the space of 12 or 13 miles described by the author was no more than a line intersecting a large space, and if Napoleon had moved off the high road only for a few minutes, any of the numerous sentinels posted on it would be fully justified in shooting him for an attempt to escape, an event very likely to have happened during the rapidity of his movements on horseback when he did not ride out before Sir Hudson's arrival, and the ambiguity of the orders which had been given to the soldiers subsequent to that event. Napoleon's reasons for confining himself were in order to prevent the possibility of his being stopped, insulted, and detained by the sentinels, as had happened to all the members of his suite who ventured out, not even excepting the ladies, either caused by the blunders of private soldiers, the ambiguity and obscurity of orders given to them, or otherwise. General Gourgaud, in particular, was, during his rise within the limits, stopped almost daily upon the high road by the sentinels and detained until, to use a seaman's expression, he had been overhauled by the sergeant or corporal commanding the guard. Previous to Sir Hudson Lowe's arrival at St. Helena, some degree of social intercourse existed between Longwood and the respectable inhabitants and others residing on the island, and instead of shunning as a basilisk the very sight of the British uniform, a week scarcely passed that officers clothed in that uniform did not dine at Napoleon's table. Napoleon himself frequently rode out on horseback or in a carriage, by means of which his person became familiar to the soldiers and others who were entrusted with the charge of him. It is a fact which deserves to be recorded that during the time this system was in force, not a single letter was sent from Longwood unless through the regular government channels. The state of affairs, if not wholly agreeable, was at least tolerable, and some regard was paid to decency. Immediately after Sir George Cockburn's departure, Sir Hudson Lowe changed everything which had been established by his predecessor, approved of by the government, that had given sufficient satisfaction to the French, and lasted 9 months without having produced the least inconvenience. In lieu of this, he introduced a system of restrictions without a parallel in British history, denying at first that he had altered anything, but subsequently asserting to the inhabitants of Longwood that Sir George Cockburn had, previous to his departure, acknowledged to him that great inconvenience was produced by the system then enforced, that he, Sir George Cockburn, had then suggested and strongly recommended the rigorous alterations which he had since been compelled to put into execution. This artifice failed, however, in producing the intended effect, as nobody at Longwood gave the smallest credit to his assertions. In the meantime, Napoleon confined himself to the house, conceiving, and with good reason, that submitting to avail himself of the privilege of going out under such conditions as those imposed by Sir Hudson Lowe would be no less degrading to his character than mortifying to his feelings, while it must be in his case particularly give ample grounds to calumniators like the author of the Facts to display their malignity by representing him as a man who, though pusillanimous fear of death, was glad to sacrifice his future reputation and submit to every species of degradation, even to that of being led about like a wild beast by his keeper in order to purchase a few more years of a dishonorable existence in captivity. This state of confinement and inactivity, combined with the effects of the climate, want of society and amusement, and the vexations inflicted upon him, could not fail to produce disease on a man who, during the preceding part of his life, had his mental and bodily faculties so actively and continually employed, consequently hepatitis, which its usual train of distressing symptoms followed. When the complaints were made by the prisoners of the treatment they received from Sir Hudson Lowe, the latter frequently replied either by verbal insinuations of turning them off the island or by enclosing them in such extracts as the following from Lord Bathurst's correspondence. It appears very desirable that the officers who are allowed to continue with him should clearly understand that their protracted residence at St. Helena is an act of indulgence shown by the Prince Regent for the purpose of rendering the confinement of General Bonaparte as little irksome to him as the circumstances of the case will admit. They therefore ought to be fully aware that any abuse of this indulgence, either on his part or on theirs, will require an alteration in the system which His Royal Highness has been desirous of adopting in this particular. Had they understood their real situation, it cannot be imagined that they would have ventured to send you the declarations of which you transmitted to me the copies. London, July 9th, 1816.